Hi, I'm Brice Turner making this presentation for History 354, Revolutionary Europe. I'm going to be talking about the French Revolution. I'm going to discuss the conditions in France leading up to the Revolution, the democratic ideologies that would force out the monarchy, and how we can think about the Revolution in general. So in late 18th century France, we have a population that's about 26 million. It's composed of three estates. The first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, nobility, would comprise a very small percentage of the population, leaving an amalgam of everyone else in the third estate. So this is going to include middle class, peasant class. We also have the feudal system still operating in France at this time. The serfs live on the land and work the land that's owned by the lords, and they pay seigneurial dues in exchange for protection. And at this time, these dues were increasingly abused by the lords, making life more difficult for serfs who are already poor to begin with. The system of government we have is, of course, a monarchy. Louis XVI and the nobility share some of their power. But briefly, I wanted to mention Louis XV. In a Desacralized king, Roger Chartier marks a time period in France in which the reverence of royal titles is waning. The people no longer are holding such positions as divine and beginning to criticize a little more, and this is something that the royalty is obviously hearing. There would be some riots in Paris that would precede an order by Louis XV when he decided to arrest child beggars and wanderers that were in the street. And in 1757, there was an assassination attempt by Robert Damiens on the king. Now, Louis XVI would experience some similar troubles. There'd be an economic drought in the few years right before the revolution. It would get really bad. Trade with British textiles would lead to a lot of unemployment for weavers and spinners in France. A bad silk harvest and bad weather would hurt the grain farmers and arouse further hunger for a large class of people that were already hungry. And Louis would impose more taxation on almost anything because of war debts and other stuff. So a few of the common grievances I'm going to read from the Town Country Grievances of the Modern History Sourcebook, and these are just a few from the town of Vire. That in the assembly of the Estates General, opinions be counted by head and not by order. That only the assembled nation may consent to taxes, loans, and new offices, and no corporation, organization, or provincial estates be allowed to represent the nation. That each new assembly of states be preceded by a new choosing of deputies, so that no citizen can perpetually represent the nation. And that nobility no longer be a title inhering in the proprietorship of office, but that it be the reward of services rendered to the state. Now, these are just some grievances from one town, but these type of things were common all over France. People were fed up with the system, the monarchy. So some of the ideology that led to the revolution we find in Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire. Censer and Hunt write that both would decry a natural order set up by God, and instead advocate for reason and talent to be the means that an individual can make their way in the world. At the time, there was no social mobility, and Rousseau and Voltaire believed there should be more mobility in France. Rousseau would be the main ideological force. He was born in 1712. He was a prolific writer and music copyist, and lived in poverty his entire life. He would provide the origin, democratic and also totalitarian thought. He advocated that reason would replace tradition, scripture, and custom as the judgment in all types of affairs. His main piece of writing in 1762, The Social Contract, would advocate that people make the laws that they are to live under. And quoting from the Modern History Sourcebook, "Since no man has a natural authority over his fellow, and force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of legitimate authority among men." So he would advocate for a government to represent the general will of the population. And another quote, "There is in the state no fundamental law which cannot be revoked, but government," he would also say government has unlimited power to make all these things happen. This is where the totalitarian thought kind of comes from. So the ideas of Rousseau and Voltaire would come from mostly clubs such as the Jacobins and the Cordeliers Club, and these were mostly lawyers, middle-class lawyers that had formed these clubs to talk about problems in France and their ideas of popular sovereignty and getting power and government into the hands of the people. Some ideas would also be inspired by the American Revolution literature, which was translated into French, and the Declaration in '76 would also be translated to French. So this would give a little boost to the revolutionaries, seeing that it's happening in the New World. So as the Third Estate would create a national assembly organized by the deputies of the clubs. They would demand voting by head, and this is where Louis begins to lose some control. He would kind of feign interest in their demands. He listened, but then he would bar them from their meeting hall, and he would also fire his finance minister, Jacque Necker, who was kind of the only sympathizer with the National Assembly. And when he fired Necker, this would spark outrage among Parisians and would lead to armed battles in the streets between the people and soldiers. They would loot shops for weapons, and simultaneously other factions of people would seek to lower the price of grain by attacking customs barriers at the borders of the city. This is also where the siege of Bastille prison would take place. The Bastille governor's head would end up on a pike. And this event is significant because of the multitude of people that participated in revolutionary action. The royal family, realizing they're losing control, would attempt to escape the country and seek help. Eventually they were caught, and Louis would be arrested and tried by the National Assembly and executed on January 21st of 1793. Wanted to mention a couple examples of revolutionary ideology. Immediately after the king was executed, Censer and Hunt quote a journalist who wrote, "We have just convinced ourselves that a king is only a man and that no man is above the law." And then also Maximilian Robespierre, who was a deputy of the National Assembly and later Speaker of the Committee of Public Safety. In his writings, in The Cult of the Supreme Being, we can see Rousseau's influence. He says, "It is wisdom above all that our guilty enemies would drive from the Republic. To wisdom alone it is given to strengthen the prosperity of empires. Let us be grave and discreet in all our deliberations as men who are providing for the interests of the world." So again, advocating reason over tradition and everything that the country had been working from: religion, tradition, scripture. Also, I wanted to mention the new revolutionary calendar, created in September 22nd of 92. It would begin with year one, and it would abolish the 7 days to kind of bring about some confusion, so people wouldn't know which day is Sunday, the worship day. There would instead be 10 days a week. They would change the names of the months that would instead reflect the seasons. And from Nicholas Restive's Diary of the Terror. He has an entry, October of 93. He says, drummers were in the street this morning to warn all shopkeepers to remain open. This is on a Sunday. If anyone closed, it would be a sign of counter-revolution, someone that doesn't believe. So this leads up to the Terror, period 1793 to 94. This is kind of a focus point in the revolution because this is where we see the totalitarianism emerge, that violence was deemed necessary to prevent counter-revolutionary groups. So the Committee of Public Safety is trying to protect the new republic at this point. Many citizens are accused of conspiring, and they're arrested and given quick, often unfair trials and sentenced to the guillotine. Censer and Hunt estimate over 40,000 were executed in this short period. Another quote from Restive, he writes, "The police are so busy arresting political suspects, they neglect ordinary crimes." Many of his entries in the Diary of the Terror exhibit his own fear to speak his mind and instead go along with the crowd to seem a patriot of the new republic. In September of 93, he writes of a new law detailing who may be suspect of being counter-revolutionary. He writes, "Everyone who by word or writings has shown himself an enemy of liberty, anyone who can't explain the source of his livelihood, anyone who has been refused a civic certificate or been expelled from a patriot club, any public official who has lost his job, and anyone who left France since the start of revolution, even if they've returned, these people are all to be considered suspect." And one more entry, he says, "You had to pretend to be happy at the death of a friend or relative, even if you didn't want to perish yourself. If you didn't want to perish yourself." He says, "Was a citizen popular? He might start a civil war. Suspect. Did he try to retire instead? Suspect. Were you rich? Suspect. Were you poor? You must be hiding something. Suspect. Were you melancholy? The state of the nation must upset you. Suspect." So pretty much anyone could be arrested for almost anything, and the guillotine was a symbol of fear. People were afraid to be beheaded for almost anything. So after this period of the Terror, we come to the Thermidorian reaction. It happened in the revolutionary month of Thermidor, which is July of 94. So up until this time, the revolution has been operating in a radical phase. Knutsen and Bailey, working from Crane Britton's writings on revolution, they say the radical phase will bring about the Thermidorian reaction. So what happened? The Committee of Public Safety at this point has been executing so many people, many which actually fought for revolution in the first place. There comes a day when Robespierre is ready to produce another list of suspects, and he's actually arrested and executed himself. Knutsen and Bailey write that this struggle on the far left of the political spectrum allows the rise of military leaders such as Oliver Cromwell, George Washington, and in case of France, Napoleon Bonaparte. So just a few years after the Terror, Napoleon, a military general, would rise to power and rule from 1799 to 1815. The central question with Napoleon is whether his rule ended the revolution or did he continue the ideologies of the revolution. So unlike the National Assembly, Napoleon would celebrate himself instead of the collective. He would compare himself to other great military leaders such as Caesar, Alexander, and Hannibal, saying that significant battles could not have been won without their leadership. Coming to power, he would reorganize the legislature and transitioned many powers to himself and other positions that he had appointed. So no more free elections. He's appointing pretty much everybody. In conquering new territory, which would be most of Europe, he would implement his Napoleonic Code, which did have some good things. It would define and ensure property rights. It would guarantee religious liberty, equalize the rights of men, and provide welfare to assist mothers in poverty, and also an adoption system to discourage abortion. However, in limiting and censoring speech and writing and art, he would be diminishing a revolutionary ideal. And this is something we can also see that Joseph Stalin would do later on, limiting certain forms of art to things that would favor themselves and no criticism whatsoever. Censer and Hunt note a decree that would reduce newspapers in Paris from 73 in 1800 to just 4 in 1811. Napoleon would also reintroduce noble titles that had been done away with and create new ones, and they'd be based on wealth or success as a military leader, some sort of prominence. So he'd create new titles. So was the revolution a success? I think up until Napoleon's authoritarian rule, we can call it a success. Louis XVI was ousted. The monarch was replaced with a new institution governed by the people. They were allowed to speak freely and helped create the laws they were to live under. Napoleon's rule would, like I said, continue some of these ideals, but it would also revert some back to pre-revolutionary stature. So in general, Crane Britton, one of the scholars of revolution, wrote in the 1930s, he wrote The Anatomy of the Revolution. He uses the analogy of a sickness, with symptoms at the onset, duration of the illness, and the recession and healing phase. He sees revolution as happening in a closed system. So he would view factors such as Louis's inability to alleviate poverty, increasing taxes, and the intellectuals such as Rousseau, who were born in France. He would see these factors as culminating in the revolution. Later writers, that Knutsen Bailey mentioned 3 generations. So the third generation would see revolutions as transcending borders to an international context. The contradictions inherent in society, Marxism, are essential to this view. So it would emphasize the importance. This view would emphasize the importance of France's rivalry with Britain in the textile market, the trade, as well as their rivalry for colonies in the New World and taking sides in the American Revolution. And also there's ideological factors that would originate outside of France, such as the American colonists fighting for freedoms right before the French did. So this third generation, which includes Theta Scotchpole, would see things outside of France's borders as giving rise to the revolution. And there's one similarity I wanted to focus on. The Censer and Hunt make a comparison at the end of the book of the terror in France to the Soviet Gulag system. So Stalin would utilize the gulags as a re-education tool for individuals who didn't subscribe to communist ideology. And these camps were way out of the way, separated from society. So individuals would be isolated for long periods of time. Stephen Kotkin writes in his book Magnetic Mountain what he calls Speaking Bolshevik, He writes about the workday and downtime of workers in Soviet Russia. He says that boasting about one's skills or the trade they learned from their family would be accompanied by gracious compliments of communism and thanking socialist values for making their livelihood possible. So the comparison in Restief's Diary of Terror, we can also see that individuals often embellished or outright lied to fit into society for fear of being labeled an outcast or a non-believer or a counter-revolutionary. But it's also important to note at this stage of revolution in the Soviet Union, it's different than the time of the terror in France, which the terror is still in the radical phase, and at this point in the Soviet Union, where Stalin is reinvigorating socialist values, they've already passed through the radical phase. And okay, and I think that's it. Thanks for watching.